original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Catherine Hartwell stood frozen at the threshold of her family's garden, watching through tear-blurred eyes as James Blackwood slipped a gold band onto her sister Eleanor's finger beneath the white rose arbor. Sunlight caught on Eleanor's triumphant smile as she accepted the vows Catherine had waited 3 years to hear. The invitation card bearing tomorrow's date, when James had promised to propose to Catherine, lay crumpled in her trembling hand, its elegant script now a mockery of her patience. Around them, guests who had believed Catherine to be James's intended whispered behind gloved hands, their pitying glances more painful than any spoken condemnation. With practiced composure, Catherine straightened her shoulders and quietly closed the French doors, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her public collapse. For 3 years, Catherine Hartwell had been the model of patient devotion. She had waited with quiet dignity, while James Blackwood established himself in London society, understanding that a gentleman needed proper standing before making an offer. She had endured the knowing smiles at social gatherings, the gentle inquiries from well-meaning friends about when the long-anticipated announcement might come. She had even tolerated her mother's increasingly pointed comments about other eligible gentlemen who had shown interest, only to be gently discouraged by Catherine's steadfast loyalty to James. "Patience is a virtue, Mother," Catherine would say, her voice soft but certain. "James has asked me to wait, and I shall." And wait she did, through London seasons and country retreats, through James's business ventures and family obligations. She waited while maintaining the perfect balance expected of a future wife, present enough to be considered devoted, but not so forward as to appear desperate. She cultivated the skills a wife of his station would need, improving her French, perfecting her musical accomplishments, and developing a reputation for tasteful conversation that neither challenged nor bored. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Catherine sat in the morning room of her family's London townhouse, reviewing correspondence while sunlight streamed through tall windows. A letter from James had arrived, requesting her presence at dinner the following evening. His handwriting, usually so controlled, seemed rushed, almost eager. "I have matters of great importance to discuss," he had written. "Matters that will determine our future." Catherine's heart had quickened. After 3 years, the moment had finally arrived. She pressed the letter to her chest, allowing herself a rare moment of unbridled joy before composing herself. She would need a new dress. Perhaps the pale blue silk that brought out her eyes. She would wear her grandmother's pearl pendant, modest yet elegant. Exactly the image a future Mrs. Blackwood should present. The preparations consumed her day. She barely noticed her sister, Eleanor's absence from the house, assuming she was attending to her own social obligations. Eleanor had always been the more vivacious of the Hartwell sisters, quicker to laugh, more eager for attention. Where Catherine was patient, Eleanor was impulsive. Where Catherine was thoughtful, Eleanor was bold. They had maintained an affectionate relationship despite these differences, though Catherine had noted a certain coolness in Eleanor's manner these past months. "She merely envies your security," her mother had said when Catherine mentioned it. "Not every young woman has such certain prospects." The note arrived late that afternoon, delivered by a breathless maid who had been sent running from the church at the end of their street. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. A wedding was taking place. James Blackwood was marrying Eleanor Hartwell in a private ceremony, with only a handful of witnesses present. Catherine read the note 3 times, certain she had misunderstood. Then, still clutching the paper, she had walked, not run, for a lady never ran, to the small stone church. She arrived just as the ceremony was concluding, standing unnoticed at the back while the minister pronounced James and Eleanor man and wife. The betrayal was complete. Not only had James abandoned her after 3 years of understanding, but he had chosen her own sister, and Eleanor. Eleanor had accepted him, knowing full well what it would mean to Catherine. Catherine did not create a scene. She did not collapse in tears or demand explanations. She simply turned and walked home, her steps measured, her face composed even as her world crumbled around her. By the time she reached her room, the news was already spreading through London society. The Hartwell household erupted in chaos. her mother alternating between rage at Eleanor's deception and concern for the family's reputation, her father locked in his study, refusing to speak to anyone. The following day brought no clarity. James and Eleanor had departed immediately for his country estate, leaving behind only a brief note explaining that they had fallen deeply in love and could not deny their feelings. They begged understanding and forgiveness for the hasty nature of their union. Love cannot wait. Eleanor had written in a postscript that felt like a deliberate cruelty. Sometimes one must seize happiness rather than wait for it to arrive. The implications were clear. Catherine's patience had been mistaken for passivity, her loyalty for lack of passion. While she had waited dutifully, Eleanor had acted. While Catherine had respected social conventions, Eleanor had disregarded them entirely. The scandal consumed London society for weeks. Catherine endured the whispers, the sudden silences when she entered rooms, the overly kind inquiries about her health. She maintained her dignity throughout, neither confirming nor denying the rumors that circulated about the circumstances of the marriage. When asked directly about her feelings, she would simply say, "I wish them every happiness," in a tone that revealed nothing of her broken heart. But dignity in public did not ease the private pain. Nights brought sleeplessness, and days brought the exhaustion of constant performance. The betrayal was twofold: the loss of the future she had planned, and the knowledge that her own sister had taken it from her. The home that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a prison of memories and whispers. "You cannot stay in London," her Aunt Margaret declared when she visited a month after the wedding. "The gossip will never cease while you remain. Come to Thornfield. The country air will restore your spirits, and distance will give you perspective." Aunt Margaret, her father's sister, was a widow of comfortable means, who had always maintained a certain independence unusual for women of her generation. Her estate in Derbyshire was modest but beautiful, far from London society and its cruel memories. Catherine accepted the invitation with gratitude. The night before her departure, she stood in her bedroom, surveying the space that had witnessed her transformation from hopeful girl to humiliated woman. She packed lightly, leaving behind the gowns she had commissioned for her life as Mrs. Blackwood, the books James had given her, the small tokens of their understanding. She would begin anew, carrying nothing that would remind her of what she had lost. As the carriage pulled away from London, Catherine did not look back. The city that had witnessed her patient devotion would now witness her absence. She would disappear from the gossip, from the pitying glances, from the social circles that had once seemed so important. In the quiet of the countryside, perhaps she would find the strength to rebuild herself. Not as the woman who had waited for James Blackwood, but as someone entirely new. What she could not know, as the London skyline faded behind her, was that this retreat was not an ending, but a beginning. That sometimes the most devastating losses clear the path for unexpected grace. That in 6 months' time, she would return to London changed, and that change would catch the attention of a man who saw value in quiet strength rather than social performance. 6 months passed at Thornfield with the gentle rhythm of country life. Catherine rose with the sun, walked the rolling hills of her aunt's estate, and gradually found a peace she had not thought possible in those first dark days after the betrayal. Aunt Margaret proved to be both a compassionate companion and a model of self-sufficiency that Catherine had rarely encountered among women of her acquaintance. A woman's value is not determined by the man who chooses her, Aunt Margaret would say as they sat by the fire in the evenings, nor by the one who fails to. Under her aunt's guidance, Catherine discovered strengths she had never exercised in London. She learned to manage household accounts, to make decisions without seeking approval, to find satisfaction in accomplishments that would never be displayed in a drawing room. The sharp pain of betrayal gradually dulled to a background ache, present but no longer debilitating. When Aunt Margaret suggested a return to London for the spring season, Catherine's first instinct was refusal. But there was wisdom in her aunt's gentle insistence. "Hiding forever would give them too much power over your life," she said. "Return with your head high. Show them that Catherine Hartwell is more than a woman who was left behind." And so Catherine found herself once again in London, though not at her family's townhouse. She would stay with Aunt Margaret in her modest but respectable home in Mayfair, removed from the immediate reminder of her family's part in her humiliation. Her parents had written occasionally during her absence, their letters, filled with news of Eleanor's new life as Mrs. Blackwood, and awkward attempts to include Catherine in family matters, without mentioning the circumstances that had driven her away. The first social gathering Catherine attended was a musical evening at Lady Pembroke's home, a deliberate choice, as the intimate setting would allow for a controlled reintroduction to society. As she entered the drawing room on her aunt's arm, the momentary hush and quick resumption of conversation confirmed that her story remained fresh in London's collective memory. "Courage, my dear," Aunt Margaret whispered. "Remember who you are now." Catherine moved through the room with quiet dignity, acknowledging acquaintances with composed smiles and brief exchanges. She noted the careful avoidance of certain topics, the overly bright inquiries about her time in the country, the studied casualness with which no one mentioned either James or Eleanor. It was during a brief moment alone, while examining a display of miniature paintings, that Catherine first became aware of being observed. She turned slightly to find herself under the thoughtful gaze of a tall, distinguished man, standing near the doorway. Unlike the other guests, whose looks had been furtive or pitying, his regard was direct and assessing, neither sympathetic nor judgmental. She recognized him immediately, though they had never been formally introduced. The Duke of Westmoreland, Alexander Blackwood, no relation to James, though the coincidence of surnames now struck her as ironic. His reputation was one of reserved intelligence and uncompromising integrity, a man who moved through society with purpose rather than pleasure. Their eyes met briefly before Catherine returned her attention to the paintings. Unwilling to appear either flustered or interested, she was surprised when, some minutes later, he appeared at her side. "Miss Hartwell," he said with a slight bow, "I believe we share an appreciation for Hilliard's work. His attention to detail is remarkable for such small canvases." Catherine was momentarily startled, both by his direct address and by the ordinariness of his observation. There was no undercurrent of curiosity about her situation, no careful avoidance of her eyes, no hint of the rescue that some gentleman might have attempted to offer a woman in her position. "Indeed, Your Grace," she replied, gathering herself. "I particularly admire how he captures light. It seems to come from within the painting, rather than falling upon it." He nodded, studying the miniature before them. An apt observation. Few noticed that quality in his work. Their conversation continued with a natural ease that surprised Catherine. The Duke spoke of art with genuine knowledge, rather than social platitudes, asking her opinions without condescension, and offering his own without dominance. When Lady Pembroke announced that music would begin shortly, he escorted Catherine to a seat beside her aunt with simple courtesy before taking his own place across the room. Throughout the performance, Catherine found herself occasionally aware of his presence, though he made no attempt to catch her eye or signal any special interest. It was this very lack of performance that distinguished him from other gentlemen she had encountered since her return. There was no sense that he was publicly associating with her to make a point or to demonstrate his magnanimity. As the evening concluded and guests began to depart, the Duke approached Catherine and her aunt once more. "Miss Hartwell, Lady Margaret," he said with a bow, "it has been a pleasure. I hope to see you at the Botanical Society lecture next week. Professor Whitfield's discussion of alpine flora promises to be most illuminating." It was an invitation offered without pressure, a simple acknowledgement that their conversation had been genuinely enjoyed rather than socially performed. Catherine found herself nodding. "We had planned to attend," she said, surprising herself with the ease of her response. "My aunt has a particular interest in mountain ecosystems." "As do I," he replied with a slight smile. "Then I shall look forward to continuing our conversation." As they rode home in Aunt Margaret's carriage, Catherine reflected on the unexpected nature of the evening. She had prepared herself for pity, for awkward silences, for the careful navigation of her reduced social standing. She had not prepared for genuine conversation, or for the strange sense of recognition she had felt in the Duke's measured regard. "He sees you," Aunt Margaret said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Not your story, not your past, but you as you are now. That is rare, Catherine. Rarer than you might think. Catherine nodded, looking out at the darkened London streets. For the first time since returning to the city, she felt neither defined by what she had lost nor determined by what she must overcome. She felt simply seen. In the weeks that followed, Catherine encountered the Duke of Westmoreland at several gatherings. Their interactions maintained the same quality of measured respect established during their first meeting, neither overly familiar nor artificially distant. They did not seek each other out with obvious intent, yet somehow found themselves in conversation at each event, discussing books, art, or social philosophies with an ease that required no performance. London society noted these interactions with predictable interest. The Duke's attention to any unmarried woman would have generated speculation. His consistent acknowledgement of Catherine Hartwell, still shadowed by scandal, created a particular kind of whispered fascination. Yet the Duke himself seemed entirely unconcerned with such observations, continuing his measured life with the same quiet authority he had always maintained. He has refused at least 3 impeccable matches in recent years. Lady Pembroke informed Catherine's aunt during a garden luncheon, clearly hoping the information would travel to Catherine's ears. They say he finds most social interactions tedious, and most potential brides even more so. Catherine, seated just within earshot as intended, kept her expression neutral. She had no illusions about the Duke's attention. Their conversations were pleasant interludes in social settings. Nothing more. She was neither seeking nor expecting romantic interest, having redirected her energies toward more substantial pursuits. Following her aunt's example, Catherine had begun volunteering at a small charity that provided educational materials to children in London's poorer districts. The work gave her a sense of purpose beyond social appearances, and she found unexpected satisfaction in applying her organizational skills to something more meaningful than dinner parties or musical evenings. It was during one of her afternoons sorting donated books that Catherine encountered the Duke in a small bookshop near the charity's offices. She was examining a volume on botanical illustrations when his voice came from just behind her. "Thornton's Temple of Flora," he observed. "A magnificent work. This edition lacks the color plates that make it truly extraordinary." Catherine turned, momentarily startled by his presence outside their usual social contexts. He was dressed more simply than at formal gatherings, though still with the innate elegance that seemed effortless to him. "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "I was considering it for the children's educational collection, but perhaps something less ambitious would be more suitable." "For the Brightwell Foundation?" he asked, surprising her with his knowledge of her charitable work. At her questioning look, he added, "My mother was one of its early patrons. I maintain the family's support, though I confess I have not been as directly involved as I perhaps should be." Their conversation shifted to the foundation's work, and Catherine found herself speaking with growing animation about the children she had met, and the difference that access to books made in their lives. The Duke listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed both intelligence and social conscience. "Would you permit me to walk with you?" he asked when she mentioned needing to return to the Foundation's offices. "I find I would like to see this work firsthand, if that would not be an imposition." The afternoon took on an unexpected quality as they walked through London streets, their conversation flowing naturally between topics both serious and light. At the Foundation, the Duke observed Catherine's interactions with the children and volunteers with quiet attention, offering assistance when needed, but never imposing his status or opinions. As they parted later, he said simply, "You have found meaningful work, Miss Hartwell. That is something many people spend lifetimes seeking." "It found me when I needed purpose," she replied honestly. "Sometimes the paths we don't choose lead us to places we couldn't have imagined." Something in his expression shifted at her words, a momentary vulnerability quickly contained. "Indeed," he said softly, "the unexpected path often reveals the truest landscape." In the days that followed, Catherine found herself reflecting on their encounter with a new awareness. The Duke of Westmoreland was not merely being polite in their previous interactions. He was genuinely engaging with her thoughts and perspectives. There was a depth to him that society rarely glimpsed, hidden beneath his reserved exterior and exalted position. Their next meeting occurred at a musical soiree, where the conversation inevitably turned to the upcoming wedding of a prominent society couple. The elaborate preparations and excessive displays of sentiment were being discussed with varying degrees of enthusiasm when the Duke quietly commented to Catherine, "I have always found it curious how much emphasis is placed on the spectacle of commitment rather than its substance. Perhaps because spectacle can be seen by all, while substance is known only to those involved." Catherine replied, thinking of her own experience with James, all promise and no fulfillment. The Duke studied her for a moment. "You speak from wisdom earned rather than inherited, I think." "As do you, Your Grace," she observed, recognizing in him a similar disdain for empty gestures and hollow words. Their eyes met in a moment of silent understanding. Two people who had learned to value substance over appearance, truth over convenience, and quiet integrity over social performance. It was not a romantic connection, Catherine told herself firmly, but a recognition between kindred spirits who had both, in their different ways, stepped outside society's expected narratives. Yet even as she maintained this rational assessment, Catherine could not deny the quiet comfort she found in his presence, a feeling not of passionate excitement, but of being understood without explanation, accepted without condition, and seen without judgment. The Countess of Harrington's garden party was the social event of mid-season, an elaborate affair that transformed her estate's grounds into a showcase of wealth and influence. Catherine attended with her aunt, wearing a new gown of sage green that reflected her improved circumstances without ostentation. 6 months had passed since her return to London, and while she was not restored to her previous social standing, she had established a quiet dignity that commanded a certain respect. The Duke of Westmoreland was in attendance, though occupied with various acquaintances throughout the afternoon. They had exchanged brief greetings upon arrival, but the crowded nature of the event precluded the kind of substantive conversation they typically shared. Catherine found she missed it more than she cared to admit. It was while seeking a moment's respite from the sun in the shade of a large oak that Catherine overheard a conversation not meant for her ears. Two women, partially concealed by a hedge of flowering shrubs, were discussing James and Eleanor's marriage, with the casual cruelty of those who believe themselves unobserved. "I always thought it most convenient how quickly he transferred his affections from one sister to the other," the first woman said with a laugh. "Especially when Eleanor's dowry was so significantly increased after her uncle's death." "James always did have a talent for advantageous timing," replied the second, "though I understand he presents it as a love match of the most passionate nature." "Oh, indeed. And Eleanor, as the brave sister, who could not deny her heart, despite the scandal, so much more romantic than admitting." They calculated the financial benefits down to the last shilling. Catherine stood frozen, the revelation washing over her with cold clarity. It had not been love that had driven James and Eleanor together. It had been money and ambition, dressed up as irresistible passion to make their betrayal seem somehow noble. The patient devotion Catherine had offered for 3 years had been discarded not for something more profound, but for something more profitable. Before she could retreat unnoticed, one of the women spotted her. An awkward silence fell, followed by mumbled apologies and hasty departures that only confirmed the truth of what had been said. Catherine remained in the shade of the oak, attempting to process this new understanding of her past. The betrayal, painful enough when she had believed it motivated by genuine feeling, now revealed itself as something far more calculating. She had been waiting faithfully, while James had simply been waiting for a better offer. "Miss Hartwell." The Duke's voice brought her back to the present moment. He stood several paces away, his expression concerned but respectful of her privacy. "I came to inquire if you would like some refreshment," he said. Then added more quietly, "Though I suspect what you need most at present is a moment of peace." Catherine drew a steadying breath. "What I need, Your Grace, is the dignity of not being discussed as an object of pity or scandal. Unfortunately, that seems beyond the capacity of most present." She had not intended to be so direct, but the discovery had stripped away some of her careful composure. To her surprise, The Duke nodded with understanding, rather than discomfort. "Then perhaps you would do me the honor of walking with me to the lake," he said. "I find bodies of water have a remarkable ability to make human chatter seem appropriately insignificant." They walked in silence until they reached the small ornamental lake at the far end of the gardens. Well away from the main gathering, the afternoon sun glinted off the water's surface, and a pair of swans glided serenely across its expanse. "I apologize for my forthrightness earlier," Catherine said at last. "It was uncharacteristic." "On the contrary," the Duke replied. "I find honesty far more valuable than social performance, particularly when that honesty comes from a place of self-respect rather than bitterness." Catherine looked at him with surprise. "You make a fine distinction, Your Grace." "Alexander," he said unexpectedly, "when we are away from the human chatter, as it were, I would be honored if you would use my given name." The informality of the request startled her, but there was nothing improper in his manner, only a genuine desire to step outside the formal boundaries that define their public interactions. "Then you must call me Catherine," she replied, testing the new territory between them. A comfortable silence settled as they watched the swans. Then, with quiet deliberation, Catherine said, "I overheard something today that has forced me to reconsider my understanding of past events. It seems my sister's marriage to my former fiancé was motivated less by irresistible passion than by financial calculation." Alexander showed no surprise at this revelation. "You find this changes your perspective?" "It changes everything," Catherine said, then reconsidered. "No, not everything. It changes nothing about what happened, but everything about how I have understood it. I have been carrying the weight of being insufficient, not loving enough, not passionate enough to hold his affection. Now I discover it was never about affection at all." "And this brings you pain or relief?" he asked, his gaze steady on the horizon. "Both," Catherine admitted. "Relief to know I was not lacking in some essential quality. Pain to realize I was never truly seen or valued in the first place." Alexander turned to face her fully then. Those who calculate value only in material terms will always miss the true worth of what stands before them. The simple statement, delivered without flattery or pity, touched Catherine deeply. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of several other guests, including Lady Harrington herself, who regarded their private conversation with poorly concealed interest. "Your Grace, Miss Hartwell," Lady Harrington said with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How fortunate that you have found companionship in each other. The Duke is known for his charitable attention to those in difficult circumstances." The implication was clear, and entirely misrepresented the nature of their connection. Catherine felt Alexander tense beside her, though his expression remained impassive. Before he could speak, Catherine addressed Lady Harrington directly. "I prefer not to be discussed, Lady Harrington," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Neither as an object of charity, nor as a subject of speculation. The Duke and I were enjoying the beauty of your gardens and the respite from unnecessary conversation." A startled silence followed her words. Lady Harrington's smile faltered, then reformed with brittle brightness. "Of course, my dear, I meant no offense." As the group dispersed, Catherine felt a moment of panic. Had she overstepped? Would her directness damage the Duke's reputation by association? She glanced at him uncertainly. To her surprise, Alexander was regarding her with something like admiration. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Catherine asked. "For defending not only your own dignity but mine as well," he replied. "Few people see beyond my title to recognize that I, too, might wish to be understood for myself rather than for the power or protection I can provide." In that moment, Catherine realized that their connection had deepened beyond intellectual compatibility or shared values. They had become allies in a world that sought to define them by external circumstances rather than internal truth. The realization was both comforting and unsettling, comforting in its genuine warmth, unsettling in the vulnerability it created. As they returned to the main gathering, Catherine was acutely aware of the speculation their prolonged absence had generated. Yet for the first time since her public humiliation, she found herself unconcerned with others' perceptions. What mattered was not what society saw when they looked at her, but what she now saw in herself, and what was reflected in the eyes of the man walking beside her. The invitation to Lord and Lady Pembroke's midsummer ball arrived on a morning when summer light filled Aunt Margaret's drawing room with golden warmth. Catherine opened the heavy cream envelope with the casual interest of someone whose social calendar was now comfortably filled, no longer marked by anxiety about her reception. The contents, however, caused her breath to catch. Listed among the honored guests were Mr. and Mrs. James Blackwood, recently returned from an extended stay at his family's northern estate. "Eleanor and James will be there," Catherine said quietly, passing the invitation to her aunt. Aunt Margaret studied both the invitation and Catherine's face with equal attention. "And how do you feel about that, my dear?" Catherine considered the question honestly. Curious, perhaps. Not wounded, not anymore. It was true, she realized with mild surprise. The sharp pain that had driven her from London had dulled to a distant memory, replaced by a life of substance and meaning. The revelation at Lady Harrington's garden party had completed a transformation that had been months in the making. She no longer saw herself as the woman who had been left behind, but as someone who had found her own path forward. The night of the ball arrived with the usual flurry of preparation. Catherine chose a gown of deep blue silk, elegant without being ostentatious, and wore her hair in a simple style that suited her natural beauty, without attempting to compete with more elaborate fashions. As she studied her reflection, she recognized with quiet satisfaction that she looked like herself, not a woman trying to prove something to society or to former loves, but simply Catherine Hartwell, comfortable in her own presence. The Duke of Westmoreland, Alexander, as she now thought of him in private moments, had mentioned he would be attending the ball, though they had not made specific plans to meet. Their connection had continued to deepen through conversations at various social gatherings and occasional encounters at the Brightwell Foundation, where he had become more directly involved in supporting educational initiatives. The Pembroke ballroom was ablaze with candlelight when Catherine and her aunt arrived. They were greeted warmly by their hosts and immediately drawn into the swirl of conversation and music that defined such evenings. Catherine was midway through a discussion with an acquaintance when she felt a shift in the room's energy, a subtle reorientation of attention that preceded the arrival of someone significant. She turned to see Eleanor and James entering the ballroom, her sister resplendent in a gown of crimson silk that emphasized both her beauty and her confidence. James looked much as Catherine remembered, handsome in a conventional way, his smile practiced and his manner assured. They moved through the room with the easy entitlement of those who believe themselves forgiven any transgression. Catherine observed them with a detachment that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. She could now see James clearly, not as the man she had loved, but as someone driven by calculation rather than feeling, ambition rather than connection. And Eleanor, there was a brittleness to her sister's smile that suggested her triumph had perhaps not brought the satisfaction she had anticipated. "They make a handsome couple," said a familiar voice beside her. Catherine turned to find Alexander standing nearby, his expression neutral, but his eyes attentive to her reaction. "They suit each other," she replied simply. "And how do you fare, seeing them again?" he asked, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Catherine considered the question. "I find I'm more curious than affected, like observing characters in a play I once knew well, but can now view from a distance." Alexander nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Distance provides clarity, if we have the courage to see clearly." Their conversation was interrupted by the beginning of a set of dances. Alexander offered his hand. "Would you do me the honor, Catherine?" as they took their places. Catherine was acutely aware of the attention they drew. The Duke rarely danced, and his choice of partner would not go unremarked. Yet there was nothing in his manner that suggested he was making a statement or offering public protection. Only the simple pleasure of her company. They moved through the patterns of the dance with natural harmony, their conversation flowing as easily as their steps. When the music ended, Alexander did not return her to her aunt or seek another partner. Instead, he guided her toward the refreshment table, where he procured glasses of champagne for them both. What happened next was remarkable, not for its drama, but for its quiet significance. Without announcement or obvious intent, Alexander led Catherine to the table, where he would normally be seated, the table reserved for the highest-ranking members of society present. He seated her beside him, as naturally as if she had always belonged there, engaging her in conversation while nodding acknowledgments to others at the table. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. He was not publicly declaring a romantic intention or making a show of elevating her status. He was simply according her the respect and position he believed she deserved, without explanation or apology. Across the room, Catherine caught sight of Eleanor, watching this development with an expression of mingled surprise and calculation. Their eyes met briefly before Eleanor turned away, drawing James's attention to something else entirely. Later in the evening, as the ball continued around them, Alexander asked quietly, "Would you walk with me for a moment? The music room should be quiet, and I find I would value a few minutes' conversation away from the crowd." The music room was indeed deserted, lit only by a single lamp and the moonlight streaming through tall windows. Alexander closed the door behind them, creating a pocket of stillness amid the evening's festivities. "Catherine," he said, his voice carrying a new note of deliberation, "I have come to value our conversations and your company more than I can adequately express." She felt a shift in the air between them, not the nervous anticipation of her years with James, but a settled certainty that had been building through months of genuine connection. "As have I," she replied simply. Alexander took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I do not wish to rush you, nor to be misunderstood. My regard for you has nothing to do with rescuing or redeeming, and everything to do with recognizing the woman you have become, the woman you perhaps always were, beneath the expectations placed upon you." Catherine looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, serious, intelligent, and more open than she had ever seen it. "I believe I would like to build a life with you, Catherine Hartwell," he said. "Not as a duke elevating a woman in need of status, but as a man who has found his equal in all the ways that truly matter. Would you consider becoming my wife?" In the gentle lamplight, Catherine felt the full weight of the choice before her, not a desperate grasping at security after humiliation, but a clear-eyed decision based on genuine understanding and respect. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Not because you rescued me, but because neither of us needs rescuing, because we see each other clearly and choose each other freely." Alexander's smile transformed his usually serious features. He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture of profound respect, then drew her gently into his arms. Their kiss was not a passionate claiming, but a quiet promise. Two people who had found in each other not completion, but recognition. Their wedding took place on a clear autumn morning, with golden light filtering through the stained glass windows of the small chapel on the Duke's estate. The ceremony was attended by a modest gathering: Aunt Margaret, a few close friends, and select members of Alexander's family. Noticeably absent were Catherine's parents and sister, who had received the invitation, but declined with a note citing previous commitments. The simplicity of the occasion was deliberate. Neither Catherine nor Alexander wanted their union to be a social spectacle or an opportunity for London gossips to construct narratives about redemption and rescue. What existed between them was too genuine to be displayed for public consumption. Catherine wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate embroidery, elegant but understated, much like the woman herself. As she spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, she felt none of the desperate hope that had characterized her years of waiting for James. In its place was a calm certainty, a choice made with full awareness rather than romantic idealization. "I take you not as a harbor from storms," she had written in her vows, "but as a companion with whom to navigate all weathers. I choose you with clear eyes and an open heart." Alexander's response had been equally forthright. "I offer not protection or position, but partnership and truth. What we build together will be founded not on what the world expects, but on what we know to be valuable." Their life together began without the extended wedding journey typical of their social circle. Instead, they settled immediately into the rhythms of shared purpose and mutual respect that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Alexander's London residence became their primary home, though they divided their time between the city and his country estates, according to both obligation and preference. Within weeks of their marriage, Alexander proposed that Catherine take charge of the Westmoreland Charitable Foundation, which had been somewhat neglected since his mother's death years earlier. "You have both the organizational mind and the compassionate heart it requires," he said as they discussed the possibility over breakfast one morning. "And I have observed how the work at Brightwell has brought you satisfaction." Catherine accepted the responsibility with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I would like to focus particularly on educational opportunities for young women," she said. "Not just literacy, but practical knowledge that allows for self-sufficiency." Under her direction, the foundation expanded its work considerably, establishing small libraries and educational programs throughout Alexander's holdings and beyond. Catherine approached the work not as a duchess performing charity, but as a woman who understood the value of knowledge and independence. Alexander supported her efforts without attempting to direct them, offering counsel when asked, but trusting her judgment implicitly. Their partnership extended to all aspects of life, each respecting the other's areas of expertise, while maintaining open communication about matters that affected them both. It was this quality of mutual respect that most surprised those who observed their marriage. The Duke, known for his decisive management of his affairs, deferred to Catherine in matters where her insight was superior. Catherine, raised to believe in male authority, spoke her mind freely and saw her opinions valued. They had achieved a balance rare in their society, a true partnership rather than the more common arrangement of separate spheres. 6 months after their wedding, Catherine received a letter from Eleanor. The contents were predictably self-justifying, explaining that she had never intended to cause pain and had simply followed her heart. What was unexpected was the request at the end. Eleanor wished to visit, to restore the sisterly bond that had been broken. Catherine the letter with Alexander that evening as they sat in the library, the space that had become their sanctuary for honest conversation. "What do you wish to do?" he asked after reading it. Catherine considered the question carefully. "I think I would like to see her," she said finally. "Not to restore what was broken. That isn't possible. But perhaps to establish something new, with clearer boundaries and expectations." Eleanor's visit a month later was initially strained, filled with careful conversation and avoided subjects. James had remained in the country, a decision for which Catherine was grateful. Over tea in the drawing room, Eleanor maintained the fiction that their marriage had been a matter of irresistible affection, though her eyes darted away whenever she spoke of love. It was only when Catherine showed Eleanor through the house, pausing at the antique clock in the hallway, that honesty finally emerged between them. "It stopped working years ago," Catherine explained. "But Alexander found a craftsman who understood its mechanism. It required patience to restore. Each gear and spring had to be carefully examined, cleaned, and sometimes replaced." Eleanor watched as Catherine wound the clock with a small brass key. The mechanism began to tick, steady and true. "Some things, once broken, can never be the same," Catherine continued, her voice gentle but direct. "But they can be rebuilt into something that functions differently, perhaps even better than before." Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "I didn't love him," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I thought I would grow to love him after we married." But she didn't finish the thought. But she didn't need to. Catherine could see the truth in her sister's face. The calculation that had seemed clever had resulted in a marriage, as empty as the promises that had formed it. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Eleanor said after a moment. "Forgiveness isn't what matters," Catherine replied. "Understanding does. I understand now that we were both caught in expectations that served neither of us well. I was patient when I should have been discerning. You were opportunistic when you might have been honest." As Eleanor prepared to leave later that afternoon, Catherine walked with her to the carriage. Their goodbye was not warm, but it was genuine, an acknowledgement of a shared past and a tentative opening toward a different future. That evening, as Catherine and Alexander sat together in the library, she reflected on the day's events. "I used to believe that patience was the greatest virtue," she said, watching the fires glow. "That waiting faithfully would eventually bring reward." Alexander considered her words. "And now?" "Now I believe that active choice is more valuable than passive waiting," she replied. That discernment matters more than endurance. That time doesn't heal wounds. It simply gives us the distance to see more clearly and choose more wisely. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the contours of her wedding ring. "And what do you see clearly now?" Catherine smiled, the expression reaching her eyes with a warmth that had become characteristic of her new life. That true love isn't about being chosen or rescued. It's about two people recognizing each other's value and choosing to build something meaningful together. As the clock in the hallway chimed the hour, steady and true, Catherine leaned against her husband's shoulder. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their light constant and clear. Within the quiet of their home, Catherine and Alexander continued their conversation, two people who had found in each other not the fulfillment of romantic fantasy, but the deeper satisfaction of being truly seen, respected, and chosen day after day, in all weather, without reservation or regret.